Good morning, happy Sabbath. Today I'm going to be reading from the verse of Luke 6, verses 43 to 45. No good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes, or grapes from briars. A good man brings good things stored up in his heart, and an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of.
Is there any fruit on my tree? Most definitions of success include references to achieving goals, acquiring health, prestige, favour, and power. Successful people enjoy the good life, that is, being financially and emotionally secure, being surrounded by admirers, and enjoying the fruits of their labours. They are leaders. They are opinion makers. They are trendsetters. Their example is emulated. Their accomplishments are noticed. They know who they are and where they are going, and they stride confidently out to meet their goals. By these standards, Jeremiah was a miserable failure. For 40 years, he served as God's spokesman in Judah. But when Jeremiah spoke, nobody listened. Jeremiah was consistent, and he urgently urged them to act, but nobody moved. And he certainly didn't attain material success. He was poor and underwent severe deprivation to deliver his prophecies. He was thrown into prison, a cistern. He was taken to Egypt against his will. He was rejected by his family, his friends, his neighbours, his audience, and even the kings of Judah. Throughout his life, Jeremiah stood alone, declaring God's message of doom, announcing the new covenant and weeping over his beloved country. In the eyes of the world, Jeremiah was not a success. Let's look at the beginning of Jeremiah's story. Let's turn to Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 4. Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 4. The Lord gave me a message. He said, I knew you before I formed you in your mother's womb. Before you were born, I set you apart and anointed you as my spokesman to the world. O sovereign Lord, I said, I can't speak for you. I am too young. Don't say that, said the Lord. For you must go wherever I send you and say whatever I tell you. And don't be afraid of the people, for I will be with you and take care of you. I, the Lord, have spoken. I want to just look at a little history from this time. After King Solomon's death, the United Kingdom of Israel had split into rival northern and southern kingdoms. The northern kingdom called Israel and the southern called Judah. Jeremiah was from Anathoth, which is 4 miles north of Jerusalem in the southern kingdom. This was a chaotic time, politically, morally, and spiritually, because Babylon, Egypt, and Assyria all battled for supremacy, and Judah found itself caught up in the middle of this triangle. From within this chaos, God spoke to Jeremiah, before you were born, I set you apart as my spokesman to the world. God asked him to do something impossible, to save his people from themselves. Jeremiah was to show his fellow believers of Judah how to turn back and worship true worship of their God. God wanted to save his people. He wanted them to return to him, but the people were not interested. They continued to worship other gods. What a challenge for Jeremiah. The Lord had set him apart. He had a plan for Jeremiah. Jeremiah thought he was a little bit young to be God's spokesperson, but God reassured him and put words into Jeremiah's mouth. I'm sure we can relate to some of these feelings. We struggle with new challenges because we lack self-confidence. We fear we have inadequate experience. We don't have ability. God promised to be with Jeremiah, and Jeremiah relied on that reassurance. And in verse 19 it says, "They will fight you, but they will fail, for I am with you, and I will take care of you. I, the Lord, have spoken." I believe this promise is just as valid for you and me as it was for Jeremiah. In God's eyes, Jeremiah was one of the most successful people in history. Success, in God's standards, involves faithfulness. Jeremiah produced fruit on his tree. His attitude and his actions proved his faithfulness. Although he prophesied for over 40 years and he never saw his people heed his words and turn from their sins, Jeremiah courageously and faithfully proclaimed the word of God. God said, "For I am with you, and I will take care of you." And Jeremiah believed him. I want to look now at the other end of the spectrum. It's sad to be remembered for what you might have been. Samson had tremendous potential. Not many people start life with the credentials he had. Born as a result of God's plan in the lives of Manoah and his wife, Samson was to do a great work for God, to begin to rescue the Israelites from the Philistines. Samson was given great strength in order to accomplish God's plan, but because he wasted his strength, we tend to see him as a failure. We remember him as the judge of Israel who spent his last days blind, grinding grain in an enemy prison. And we say, what wasted potential? Let's look at Samson's beginning. Judges 13, 2-5. Judges 13, 2-5. Judges 13 and verse 2. In those days, a man named Manoah from the tribe of Dan lived in the town of Zorah. His wife was unable to become pregnant, and they had no children. The angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife and said, "Even though you have been unable to have children, you will soon become pregnant and give birth to a son. You must not drink wine or any other alcoholic drink or eat any forbidden food. You will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and his hair must never be cut, for he will be dedicated to God as a Nazirite from birth. He will rescue Israel from the Philistines." Samson was to be a Nazirite, a person who took a vow to be set apart for God's service. Samson's parents made that vow for him. Sometimes a Nazirite vow is temporary, but for Samson, it was for life. Although Samson used poor judgment and sinned terribly, he accomplished much when he determined to be set apart for God. In this way, he was like the nation of Israel. As long as the nation of Israel remained set apart for God, they thrived. But they fell into terrible sin when they ignored God. Samson did none of the things he could have done. Even so, he accomplished the purpose the angels announced when they visited his parents. He will rescue Israel from the Philistines. We think that what God asked Samson to do was not possible after he was captured. But in his final act, when he fully committed himself to God, we see real results. This is the background to Samson's final act. Dagon was the chief god of the Philistines, the god of grain and harvest. Worship included human sacrifice. The temples were also local entertainment centres, and the Philistines crowded into the temples to watch what happened and even sat on the roof sometimes to see what was happening in the courtyard below. Samson was blind and had been grinding grain for a while, and during this time his hair had grown back. So let's look at Samson's last act, Judges 16 and verse 23 to 36. Judges 16, verse 23 to 30, 23 to 30. The Philistines held a great festival, offering sacrifices and praising their god Dagon. They said, "Our God has given us victory over our enemy Samson." When the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, "Our God has delivered our enemy to us. The one who killed many of us is now in our power." Half drunk by now, the people demanded, "Bring out Samson so he can perform for us." So he was brought from the prison and made to stand in the centre of the temple between the two pillars supporting the roof. Samson said to the servant who was leading him by the hand, "Place my hands against the two pillars. I want to rest against them." The temple was completely filled with people. All the Philistine leaders were there, and there were about 3,000 on the roof who were watching Samson and making fun of him. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, remember me again, O God. Please strengthen me one more time so that I may pay back the Philistine for the loss of my eyes." Then Samson put his hands in the centre pillar of the temple and pushed against them with all his might. "Let me die with the Philistines," he prayed. And the temple crashed down on the Philistine leaders and all the people. So he killed more people when he died than he had during his entire lifetime. In spite of Samson's past, God heard his prayer and destroyed the pagan temple and its worshippers. God still loved him. He was willing to hear Samson's prayer of confession and repentance and use him this final time. Samson's stunted tree was late bearing its fruit, but it did bear fruit. Every situation can be salvaged. If God can work in Samson's situation, he can certainly make something worthwhile out of yours. Samson finally recognised his dependence on God, and when Samson died, God turned his failures and defeat into victory. This story teaches us it's never too late to start over again. No matter how long you've been away from God, he's ready to hear you. However badly we have failed in the past, it's never too late for us to put our complete trust in God and return to his plan. Some people just can't stay out of trouble. When conflict breaks out, they always manage to be nearby, and reaction is their favourite action. This was Moses. He seemed drawn to what was needed to be righted. Throughout his life, he was at his finest and his worst, responding to the conflicts around him. The burning bush experience was an illustration of his character. Having spotted the fire, he just had to investigate. Whether jumping into a fight to defend Hebrew slaves or refereeing a struggle between two kinsmen, when Moses saw a conflict, he reacted. Over the years, however, an amazing thing happened to Moses. He didn't stop reacting, but he did learn to act correctly. God attracted Moses' attention first in a way he knew Moses could not resist. Let's look at that in Exodus 3. Exodus 3, verses 1 to 4. Exodus 3, verse 1 to 4. One day, Moses was tending the flock, and his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, he went deep into the wilderness near Sinai, the mountain of God. Suddenly the angel of the Lord appeared to him as a blazing fire in a bush. Moses was amazed because the bush was engulfed in flames, but it didn't burn. Amazing, Moses said to himself. Why isn't that bush burning up? I must go over and see this. When the Lord saw that he had caught Moses' attention, God called to him from the bush, Moses, Moses. Here I am, Moses replied. Later on in that chapter, God gives Moses his plan, but what's Moses' reaction? Verse 11 says Moses protested. Verse 13 says Moses protested again. Chapter 4, verse 1 says Moses protested again. Verse 10 says Moses pleaded with the Lord. Verse 13 said Moses pleaded again, please send someone else. And then the Lord said, okay, we'll include Aaron. So it would appear that Moses was not too keen to do God's bidding. We see him trying to talk God out of his plan. Moses just did not understand that he was God's choice for the job. Was he qualified? Moses grew up as a prince. He was a prince of Egypt. He had the best training. God made sure that Moses had the skills long before he called him. He also provided help for Moses in his brother Aaron. Have you ever spent time trying to talk God out of doing his work? Are you sure this is your plan for me, God? I don't have those skills. Where are the answers? I can't see it clearly. You can't tell me this journey is part of the plan. And what's the time frame? I just don't need this at the moment. But wait a minute. Isn't this God's work? Isn't God asking you to do something? Hasn't he already given you the skills you require? All God is doing is asking you to use them. Moses submitted to God's will, and his tree grew vigorously and produced abundant fruit despite its reluctant start. God did not change who or what Moses was. He didn't give Moses new abilities and strengths. He just took those characteristics that Moses had and moulded them to suit his purpose. We've contrasted some Bible characters here, the willing Jeremiah, the reluctant Moses, and the last-minute Samson. These three characters were faithful and did the Lord's bidding. Their fruitful trees took different growing pathways. God had plans for these different men. He appointed each of them for a specific purpose. I want to have a quick look at Lazarus. John 11:38 to 44. John 11:38 to 44. John 11:38 reads, Again, Jesus was deeply troubled. Then he came to the grave. It was a cave with a stone rolled across its entrance. Roll the stone aside, Jesus told them. But Martha, the dead man's sister, said, Lord, by now the smell will be terrible because he has been dead for 4 days. Jesus responded, Didn't I tell you that you will see God's glory if you believe? So they rolled the stone aside. Then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me. But I said it aloud for the sake of these people standing here, so they would believe you sent me. Then Jesus shouted, Lazarus, come out. And Lazarus came out, bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. Jesus told them, unwrap him and let him go. Jesus had not prevented Lazarus from dying. He wanted to show his followers God's power. When he called Lazarus from the tomb, he did not do it all by himself. He asked for help from Lazarus' friends. He asked them to move the stone. Jesus gave Lazarus his life, but he involved other people in releasing him from the grave. Verse 44 tells me, take off the grave clothes and let him go. And earlier he says, take away the stone. Jesus wants us to assist and support one another, to help move the stones and untangle the mess of grave clothes for other people. The more we work together with Jesus, we find that there is no stone that cannot be moved. Our efforts in helping move stones from other people's lives make our faith grow stronger. There are also, however, everyday stones that block God from our own lives. Misconceptions cause us to become convinced that we have nothing to give and no place to serve. We need other people to help release us. We are unable to remove our own stones and our own grave clothes. We need each other to help us on our journey towards life. Doing these things help our trees to grow and produce good quality fruit. Patrick needed help. He heard the sirens coming as he struggled to breathe. The first officer arrived and tried in vain to move the 1-ton bale of hay that had him pinned to the tray of his truck. This had happened during the loading, this accident where the bale of hay had fallen, pinning him onto the tray. The second officer to arrive flicked a torch into Patrick's eyes and he blinked. "He's alive," he shouted. Even working together, the two officers could not remove the hay bale. "Cut the strings," Patrick whispered. His voice was too weak and they did not hear. Patrick knew that if they would just cut the strings, the bale would fall apart and he would be dragged out of that pile of hay. "It's too heavy, we can't budge it. Hang on, we'll be back," the officers shouted as they went for help. Patrick was left alone in the growing darkness. Wonderful, painless, peaceful, irresistible sleep beckoned. He struggled to remain conscious. Where were they? Where were the fire brigade? And where was that old farmer with enough common sense to just cut the strings of the bale? It was coming on dark and Patrick was becoming chilled by the coolness of the evening. Dizziness overcame him and he began to drift off into that grey space. More sirens arrived. Patrick somehow was still breathing. 6 firemen and 2 policemen finally managed to move the bale of hay off him and lower Patrick's crushed body to the ground. Patrick's life was saved. But why didn't they just cut the strings and save him that tortured hour? There is a message in this story. How heavy is hay? A piece of hay is as light as a feather. How many pieces of hay does it take to make a ton? That weight of 16 bazillion pieces of hay wrapped in a gigantic bundle is a crushing weight. But separated, it would have been featherweight. Patrick needed help to escape the burden. He needed someone else to release him and cut the strings. Are you buried under crushing burdens, complicated schedules, trying to do too much at once? Do you need someone to help cut your strings? Maybe you're first on the scene and see the need to help release someone from their load. Just cut the strings and let them loose. You can do that much. Don't make them suffer more while you go for help. Get help after you cut the strings. God called Jeremiah to be a messenger. Remember, you're not responsible for how people respond to the Lord's message. Jeremiah is an example of a man chosen by God who was fully committed. Perhaps God only wants you to do something simple, like help your fellow believers with their everyday things. God still requires your commitment. No matter how long you've been away from God, he is ready to hear you. Every situation can be salvaged. If God can work in Samson's situation, he can certainly make something worthwhile out of yours. Samson finally recognized his dependence on God, and his final act turned his defeats into victory. Commitment made the difference. Nothing you can do can change God's love for you. Moses allowed his personality to be shaped by God. God did not change who or what Moses was. He took Moses' characteristics and moulded them, and he gave him help. Moses was a reluctant achiever. He loved God, but he needed encouragement and support to get him going. Once he was fully committed, he followed God faithfully. These three men had fruitful trees, but they all took different growth pathways. I'd now like to return to Luke 6:43. Luke 6, chapter 6, verse 43. And read that again. A good tree can't produce bad fruit, and a bad tree can't produce good fruit. A tree is identified by the kind of fruit it produces. Figs never grow on a thorn bush or grapes on a bramble bush. A good person produces good deeds from a good heart, and an evil person produces evil deeds from an evil heart. Whatever is in your heart determines what you say. Jesus reminds us that our speech and actions reveal our true underlying beliefs and attitudes. What is in your heart will automatically come out in your actions. There are many fruiting varieties of trees. We're not all apples, we're not all plums, apricots or mangoes. We will all produce different fruit, and that is part of God's plan. For each of us have a purpose. Are you growing your fruit? If you allow him, God will take what he created in the first place and use the skills he gave you in the first place for his intended purpose. But he does need you to be willing. God asks me to love my fellow man, be a loving and lovable Christian, and sometimes that's anything but easy. Sometimes it's easier to look the other way. Where there is love, there is commitment. Therefore, there's a possibility of pain, your own or shared if you're supporting somebody. But this is what God wants you to do, to show you love him by helping others. Show your fruit. Focusing on God's work keeps our fellow believers united. Our own personal agendas are not as important as the big picture. What's best for my church? How can I help it grow? We all have our special part to play, and we all need to show the love of God by our fruit, by our attitudes and how we act. We're like plants. We need soil and water and sunlight. Soil will not grow a plant without water, and a plant won't last long in water alone, but the addition of God's sunlight ensures survival, vigorous growth, and abundant fruiting. When a flashlight grows dim or stops working, do you just throw it away? Of course not. You change the batteries. When a person messes up or finds themselves in a dark place, do you cast them aside? No, just help them change their batteries. Some need AA, attention and affection. Some need AAA, attention, affection and acceptance. Some need size C, compassion, and some need D, direction. And if they still don't shine, simply sit with them quietly and share your light. God asks all of his followers to love and serve him faithfully. If you go looking for God, he will find you. Remember how God has worked through history. You are here in this place for his purpose. God's power is not confined by the narrow perspective of human limitations. There is a difference between the God we want and the God who is. Can we trade our dreams and plans for his? When you live for God, you are likely to be in the right place at the right time. Trust God completely. I now invite the singers to come forward for our final song, He Leadeth Me. Thank you.